Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we've got a very special guest, Dr. Joel Maxcy, who's the head of the Sports Business Department at Drexel University, was kind enough to join us in this episode. And we talk about the differences or the perceived differences between sports business and regular business. And he, along with some colleagues, wrote a really robust paper kind of attacking that question called The Unique Economic Aspects of Sports. And I'll include a link in the description below. But what it does is it attempts to take a really big whack at that question. And what I'll do here, just before I send you over to the interview, is it explores sort of 9 main differences or potential differences or perceived differences. Some really aren't differences, and we get into all of that, and he does in the paper as well. But I wanted to just start with listing those 9 areas, kind of to give a framework before we go over to that conversation. So the 9 main areas are: 1, the effect of rules to enhance competitive balance; 2, the question of natural monopoly in sports leagues; 3, the unique types of barriers to entry to these monopoly leagues; 4, the assumption of profit maximization or non-profit maximization; 5, the relatively large share of mind of sports that sports occupy; 6, what is the product that sports sells; 7, how sports is really just, quote, watching people work and how that creates potential for relatively high pay for athletes; 8, pricing; 9, the special antitrust treatment afforded to sports leagues. So with that as a basis, I'm going to send you over there now. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joel Maxcy of Drexel University. Thank you. A sports business professor over there, or you're in the economics department?
I'm actually I'm an economist, but I'm in the sport business department. I'm actually the head of the department of sport business at Drexel, and we're in the business school along with economics and the usual other things, finance and marketing and accounting, etc.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And one of the reasons that I reached out to you was you had done this paper, The Unique Economic Aspects of Sports. And I think one of the things that we constantly run into when, trying to analyze sports is it different from, other types of businesses? And you kind of run up on this, is it the same as selling, Dove shampoo, or are there real differences that have to be sort of accounted for? So a lot of the research you see, it's very specific and kind of siloed. And what you did in this paper, and I'll include a link, in the description, is took a real big whack at that question from kind of a wide angle. And there's a lot of different pieces that you mentioned in there. What were some of the things that kind of surprised you most when you took on this big question of what really is so different about sports as a business?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think to some degree these are things. And so Dan Rasher and Andy Schwartz, who are co-authors of this, we've known each other for a long time and have worked on things. Dan's also an academic economist at the University of San Francisco, and we finished our PhDs in economics at about the same time in the 90s. I was up at Washington State, and he was at Cal Berkeley. And so we've known each other for 20 plus years, and Andy's been a business partner of Dan for quite a long time too. And we'd worked, they did a lot of work on the Ed O'Bannon case versus the NCAA case, and I was a contributor there too. So I think part of this, it's a really good question, because in some cases, even when I'm teaching my students, I'll say, we want to think of sports as a business, that it's not really different in fundamental ways than other businesses. There's a market, and it's an entertainment product, and in many ways, owners of sports franchises have similar objectives. And so, if you look at people like Ballmer and Mark Cuban or the late Paul Allen, you would say, well, these are people who have been very successful in a lot of different lines of business, from computer software to many things, and so sports likely isn't an investment for them where they're trying to lose money. It's also something where they're looking to make a a make it a good investment, and largely it turns out to be that way. And the product is similar to other entertainment products, but we touch on some things like, why does sports get so much attention for the size of the industry? So if you were to take, for example, the NFL. So the NFL is the biggest business of the major sport leagues in the U.S. And I think 2 or 3 years ago or 4 years ago, Commissioner Goodell said we want to be a $25 million business by 2025 or something like that. And they're approaching that, so they're in the 10, 15. And yes, of course, that's a multi-billion-dollar business, is a big business, but it's dwarfed by things like Home Depot and Walmart and Apple, who are, I mean, it would be 5% of the size of some of those businesses that are literally approaching $1 trillion range now. So, but people don't spend 3 hours every morning and 3 in the afternoon listening to talk sports radio about Microsoft or Apple or Walmart, and people don't talk about it with their friend. So there is a very big interest in sports that's kind of above and beyond its actual financial value. So we touch. I mean, that's one of the points that we make in the paper, that it has this sort of overarching social interest, and it's in people's psyche more than the value of the actual businesses would say.
That outsized mind share.
Outsized mind share, exactly, and that's a really interesting thing, and that probably makes it useful in terms of its ability to promote other things, and we definitely know that's true as well. I'm trying to think if I lost my train of thought a little bit here.
That mind share.
So, I was saying. So how did we get there? So. So I guess for us, a lot of it's like, we think of it as, it is a normal business. And we want to tell our students that, you're going into, I know where I was. So owners are not necessarily unlike owners in other businesses. In fact, they probably overlap. Players are like workers, sort of. They're members of unions, and it is a job for them. But they get far more attention, and generally speaking, they're far better paid than the typical worker. If you're in the major league levels of sports, we're talking, of course, multi-million-dollar annual salaries and attention, and everything. But a lot of the same incentives apply, and we wonder, do they shirk on the job? Do they, what's behind their holdouts? Why are the unions asking for this and that? And in some ways it's typical union management behavior, but of course it again gets far more attention. And on top of that, most people from the outside world don't know how you or I perform at our jobs. They don't really. I mean, I might have students that watch me teach, and you have, of course, listeners to your podcast. So we're in a way a little more public, but most people don't have too much awareness. But we know exactly what athletes are doing.
Exactly.
And then we can not only watch them, we can look up and find exactly how their performance measured up. And so they have a very public measures of their performance. And so that's of course different too. And there's likely some effects that would be expected to have on their performance and on their lives. So in some ways it's, but we have all these sort of curious things where it's different too, and unique to sports. And that to me is why, what makes it kind of an interesting industry to study. The other thing I was going to say, so I'm in a business school, right? And so is Dan. And we have accounting, I mentioned that before, accounting, finance, business law, et cetera. All of them look at all other industries. We're the only department that looks only at a single industry, and that single industry is sports. And I think it'd be pretty hard to find another industry that has a majors devoted to it and departments devoted to it, and that's true at universities and colleges across the country. So there's something, I guess I would say there's something kind of special about sports. And then we, in that paper, took as good a look at some of these key things, and I don't know if we got all of them, and you've looked through the paper, they're kind of in some ways maybe disconnected because we jumped to a couple things already measured, but the idea of competitive balance and why that's important, monopolies, which is sort of an economic thing, but there are, I think, quite a few things that they're definitely interesting to discuss and think about what makes sports different along those lines.
Yeah, and that mind share thing is really interesting when you look at something like Oracle, like the Oracle Arena. Oracle's maybe 50 times the market cap of the Warriors.
Yeah,
and most people don't even know, you wouldn't even know it. And then so they sort of lend their name to that mind share, and they get it, they get a little more publicity from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you could make the argument that probably more people know who the Warriors are than who Oracle is, and they may only know Oracle from that association
from the
Warriors being on the stadium, and that's what makes those naming rights so valuable. I mean, because it really is that sports gets attention, and that in turn makes publicity for those companies that are associated with them really valuable, and they've shown that they're willing to pay for it too. So in Philadelphia here we have, the Wells Fargo Center. I think most people probably know Wells Fargo's the bank, but still I think their association with the Flyers and Sixers as the host of the arena, or as the name on the arena, makes them more well-known than they would be otherwise. And the football, Lincoln Financial Field is a football stadium. I don't think I don't know if I'd really heard of or had registered in my head what Lincoln Financial was or what they did. There's some financial, of course, if their name wasn't on the stadium.
Oh yeah, so, absolutely.
Across the country, that's true.
Yeah, those are fantastic examples. I thought it was funny, kind of early in the paper, you talked about like the idea of like, you might love like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or those kinds of things, but you don't really care if you like Coca-Cola, you don't really care what Pepsi's doing. But if you're, a fan of the Yankees, you very much care what the Boston Red Sox are doing. And it kind of shows when, people come to watch a game, they're going to go much more to watch even if they're a Yankees fan, they're going to go much more to watch the Yankees play Boston than, the Orioles or somebody else. And so that's kind of an interesting piece in sports that you almost, and you dig into it a little bit more, but you're trying to facilitate that competition, and your franchise is really related to how good the other franchises are.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, I think when I'm talking about sports leagues, when I talk about to my students, that dynamic where you have these literally bitter rivalries, more so. I suppose there's some pretty bitter rivalries in the corporate world too, but you really have, the Yankee Red Sox hate, or the Giants Dodgers going on, wherever. There's really bitter rivalries on the field or ice of competition or court, whichever the case may be there. So yet there has to be this cooperation to make the games happen and make them work. So you have this team league dynamic where there's really intense competition between the teams and between the customers of the teams, the fans, and at the same time they've got to cooperate all together to make those games work and
to make them entertaining. You got to have
sort of a worthy opponent. Right. So and some of that is building up, of course, the intense rivalry and hatred, or whatever you want to call it. So to make the product work, and really, I think this is quite unique too, is that the product is actually the game or the competition, and so it takes two teams to produce the product, and really that's kind of unique. Coca-Cola makes Coca-Cola. They don't need Pepsi to help them make it, but the Yankees need the Red Sox and the other teams in Major League Baseball to make the product of a baseball game and the story of the season, the league championship season over time. So to me, that's a real unique aspect of sports. And then that leads into all sorts of like, all right, so the leagues, we don't want Pepsi and Coke cooperating. Antitrust laws get at that. We don't want the airlines, Delta and United, we don't want them cooperating together too much, although they probably do. But in the case of sports, we do and we don't. Like, we don't really want them to cooperate to the point of suppressing all the pay of the athletes, which they've done in the past, of course. And we don't want them to cooperate to the point of limiting how many teams there are, or not letting teams move to maybe where, and they've done that too. But at the same time, we know they have to cooperate to set the schedule, to make consistent rules, to assign fair. So there's all sorts of situations where absolutely their cooperation is not only okay, it's necessary to make the league work as it does. So that always presents some sort of interesting legal issues and legal battles. Like, if they can join together to do this, they're already all in a room together, in a sense, the owners. What else could they do? And so some of the things that they might do may very well be illegal or violate antitrust laws, but other things are perfectly legitimate and necessary.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I think a lot of people can identify with, and you touch on it in the paper as well, is this idea that, or the argument that suppressing wages of the players or the athletes increases the competition, and that it's essential to like suppress, or maybe people don't use the word suppress, but it's essential to have, some way that you're paying these athletes that's similar across the board, or you cannot be competitive. And, I think that's kind of the biggest argument, or the biggest question is, number one, does it increase competitiveness to have, say, a salary cap, or, what is the effect of the salary cap? And then kind of like things you just touched on, how much of that, or to what extent can the leagues do this, where they're effectively bargaining against, their whole labor pool as a whole. Do you want to touch on some of that a little bit?
Yeah, that's the first topic and I think in some ways that's one of the most interesting ones. And so you can literally go through the history of sports, going back to whether it's early days of soccer in Europe and England to baseball here. And there's always been this fundamental battle between players and owners, where if there's a free market, owners will bid up the value, the wages of the best players, because they want, it's valuable to win, and you'll pay to win, and so they'll pay the best players. And they would also sort of in the back of their minds know, if we could just get together and limit that bidding for players, we'd be much more profitable. And that's where the reservation system came from in baseball. So the reserve clause, which basically up until the 1970s gave the players a contract that could be perpetually renewed. So the only way a player could change teams is if they were traded or sold. So your contract tied you to the same team forever. And so that started in the early 1900s, and baseball was able to maintain that into the 1970s. The other professional sports, more or less copied it. Baseball had an antitrust exemption, so they were able to have a little bit stronger version than everybody else. But most of the sports had largely the same system until the 1970s. And the argument always was, well, if we didn't have this, there would be no competitive balance, because this ability to sign players and then always keep them with the same team means that the good players might end up in Oakland and Baltimore and Cincinnati. And there would be some, if you looked in 1960s, 1970s baseball, some indication that, Oakland has and keeps a lot of good players, as does Baltimore and Cincinnati. They were good teams then. But the first really prominent, or one of the first prominent, I think probably given credit as the first prominent sports economics paper by Rottenberg in the 1950s, said it doesn't matter. The players will end up in the same place anyway, whether they have the reserve clause or not, because the teams can buy and sell and trade players. So they always end up with their highest valued user. And if New York is the high, then they're going to end up with the Yankees. And of in the 1950s, that was a pretty obvious situation, because the best teams at that time were the three New York teams. The Giants, Dodgers, and Yankees were consistently in the World Series. And so his point was the reserve clause doesn't matter at all to competitive balance. And they'd end up with in the same place anyway. And so I think economists that's called the invariance principle have more or less said, yeah, that's generally probably true, that these salary restrictions are more about holding down, because if there's no free market for players, their salaries are going to be much lower, and they certainly were. As soon as free agency hit in the 70s, salaries exploded, and they've continued to go up ever since. And so the real benefit, I think the argument probably is the real benefit for owners of these restrictions, whether it's reserve clause, or then we've seen salary cap by definition caps salaries, so holds down salaries. So they benefit ownership by holding down player pay. So that's their biggest cost. And so they certainly do that. There's been, so since free agencies come into play, there's been a lot of economic studies like, well, do these things matter? Did competitive balance get worse with free agency? Does the salary cap make competitive balance better? All these sorts of things, and it's kind of a mixed bag to some degree, although I would say largely we find that competitive balance doesn't change too much, if at all, depending on these restrictions, even things that would seem real obvious like salary caps. That said, I think there's some evidence to when the NHL, National Hockey League, put their hard salary cap in 2004, after the strike season of 04-05, that their overall competitive balance improved a little bit, somewhat. It's better now than before. The NFL's, famous for having instituted the hard cap in '93. The NFL has good competitive balance. I think on most measures, when you compare it to the other leagues, it's good, probably the best of the four, or most often, depending on how it's measured. But they had good competitive balance before, and good competitive balance after they instituted the cap. So we would probably say other factors go into maintaining that competitive balance in the NFL. Baseball, where you had the big free agent changeover in the mid 70s, their competitive balance in a lot of ways seemed to actually improve in the 1980s and 90s. Then we had another run where the Yankees were pretty dominant in the late 90s, early 2000s. But generally speaking, competitive balance, there's not much evidence that free agency hurt competitive balance at all in baseball. So my main draw from all of this is that owners like these restrictions, whether they're reservation clauses or salary caps or luxury taxes like you have in baseball, so all these labor market restrictions, but more to increase their bottom line. They help increase profits than to improve competitive balance. And if they do improve competitive balance, which should make the games more attractive, all the better. But I think they're
all the better,
yeah. Yeah, but
the long-term profit.
Their main thing is profits, and definitely those things hold down salaries and payroll, so they're advantageous in that way.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another. I was just going to throw this in too. So we all, one of the hallmarks of sports is like one of the reasons we like it. What makes it different from other entertainment products is that no one knows what will happen. The who wins or loses isn't predetermined, and so that's uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, we call it in sports economics. But that's been one of the hardest things to prove matters. So when we're trying to estimate, okay, what actually raises attendance or raises revenue in sports leagues, and there's a whole bunch of things that do matter. And when you try to for one thing, it's kind of hard to measure what is, although things like point, I mean, there's been some pretty good proxies for that, but it often doesn't seem to matter much. It's like when push comes to shove, things matter. Like, home fans like the quality of the home team, and they like to see the home team win. And that seems to take far, far more importance than do you expect the game to be close. I think where we found, better evidence of that is like TV sports. So if you're the NFL, for example, shows all kinds of games that they hope out of market people watch. So baseball, NHL, even the NBA are kind of home market sports. The NFL is more of a national market sport, so they want you to watch Sunday night football or Monday night football regardless of who's playing. So if you're in Philly and the Raiders are playing the Chargers on Monday night, we want you to watch that game. So those games would probably have a better, I'd rather watch a good football game on Monday night, one that I expect will be a good close contest, than a blowout. And there's more evidence than that. And there's been some evidence found in UFC fights and boxing that holds, especially for TV sports. But for stadium sports, home team effects seem to be so much more important that they just overwhelm uncertainty of outcome.
Yeah, more that the national audience wants to see the good game because maybe they're less invested in the local team just wants to see their team, or the local market just wants to see their team win.
For sure, want to see their team win, and it's maybe even would rather see a game where they know they're going to win rather than a close game. But so it seems to wash out when we're looking at and a lot of the economic analysis, because I think we have more and better data on stadium attendance and things like that than we do on TV. Ratings are a little fuzzy and harder to gauge, but but it's not as, so we always say uncertainty must matter in sports. People would care to see people don't want to go to an event where they know the outcome or know the outcome's fixed, but at the same time it's actually hard to find really strong evidence of it.
And it could vary, like you said, between types of games and,
sure, absolutely
tied the fans are. So there was something that you mentioned, about when you have these sort of fixed amounts that teams can spend on, labor, that you're potentially like not in an equilibrium because you've got teams that can commercialize or monetize that labor much more than other ones. Maybe like the Dallas Cowboys can monetize better than Tampa Bay or something. And I think you also see that in college. Like you've got college football, which has these strict impositions on like number of scholarships and that kind of stuff, but yet you still see kind of the same teams dominate and they're spending money in other areas, to kind of get around that equilibrium where, a really small school maybe can barely, afford to field the team. Whereas somebody like Alabama has, a whole hallway of doctors for the sports medicine and all that stuff to try to, sort of outspend the competition just in a different avenue.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think, maybe one of the best illustrations of the salary cap, because in a sense, college sports have the hardest salary cap, payroll cap you can possibly have. So the Division I football limit is 85 scholarships. So they've got a payroll cap in a sense, because scholarships are the compensation, and those scholarships are limited to tuition, books, cost of attendance. So there's a little bit more variations with the cost of attendance fluctuations since the court ruling of 7 or 8 years ago, but still it's a very rigid salary cap in a way, if you want to call it a salary cap or a compensation cap. And competitive balance, and I mean, if you look at NCAA, I mean, you said it exactly, it's not, I mean, compared to professional sports, it's rather poor, and probably more so even in recent years. So you definitely have to have a relatively small group. If you talk about that college football playoff, I mean, it's been Alabama, Clemson, and regularly and a couple other teams that float in and out, but not much balance in at the top, certainly. And so the question is, well, if the compensation is the same everywhere, why wouldn't competitive balance be really tight in college sports? and you said it exactly right. There's all kinds of other things that are offered that's not equal across sports. So facilities, I mean, if you compare facilities at the SEC schools at Alabama and Georgia, or the AC Clemson, to smaller schools in the Northeast, there's no comparison at all. And winning is still very valuable. So, and players help you win. So they want to do the things that attract those best players. So if you can't pay more than a scholarship, you can give them a fabulous locker room, a fabulous athletic dorm with water parks and lazy rivers are the things that they talk about. So you can really almost go overboard in that way, and because you don't see the NFL offering those types of benefits, and there are some NFL facilities now where they have preseason training camp that are reasonably nice, but I think that from what I've seen, they don't really compare to the college training facilities in terms of the amount invested, because in the NFL they're paying the players, so they don't need to do those things. And the other big investment in college sports is, of course, coaching. So the coaches that have proven themselves to be winners get really high salaries, and so you see the SEC coaches or the Power Five coaches far salaries that far exceed their Group of Five and Division 1A rivals for sure.
Oh yeah. How do you think some of the like name, image, and likeness and that kind of stuff will affect that? Do you think it will increase competition or have no effect? Or
yeah, that's a really good question. I think probably in some ways the jury's out. We don't. I mean, it's hard to see how this is shaken out, or how it will shake out overall. But there's been we've been less than a year into it, so really starting this summer they could get NIL contracts, and there seem to be some. My sense is that it won't change the competitive balance that much, that the places that have the best NIL opportunities will be pretty consistent with the places that are already winning and already big names. So if you're the Alabama quarterback, you're likely to get much better NIL opportunities than if you were the quarterback at San Jose State. So my sense is that the resources were probably already there, and so you had donors or companies that were donating to the athletic department directly that may go now directly to the athletes, but all in all, that amount of money will be relatively the same, so it probably won't have much effect at all on competitive balance. I think there's some things that might be, remain to be seen, like urban areas might become, just because there's more opportunities. So, for example, a school like Temple in Philadelphia is in a big city.
okay.
I mean, Temple hasn't really ever been a very big player in the national football scene, but it might, because there's a bigger market potentially for NIL in a big city like Philadelphia, it might make it more attractive. Maybe Los Angeles, schools in New York, that but I don't know that that's true, but there could be some sort of shifts like that, where there may be a market that was kind of beyond the traditional university market for sponsorships and so forth.
Yeah. And then to kind of shift gears a little bit, I know you mentioned kind of in the US, we have sort of a single dominant league, or a single like top level league for each sport, whereas other countries and even the US in the past has had, separate leagues, but then they sort of meet in this, end of season championship or something like that to sort of reassure everybody that they're still seeing all the best people. What kind of effects does that have on, franchise values, on the labor earnings, on that kind of stuff? Or does it have an effect to have, the single league with its own playoffs versus, multiple leagues that are maybe have different things, they're governed in different ways, and then they meet at the end of the year or something like that?
Yeah, that's one of the great, I think it's one of the puzzles of the market for sports. And yeah, and you're absolutely right. And we talked about that some in the paper. So you have in Europe, you have literally a major league for every country, and they're restricted by those international boundaries. So you have really, I mean, you could say you have 5 major leagues with the 5 big soccer leagues, but every country has a league, and they don't cross over until they play in the UEFA Championships Cup the next year. They have the tournament, and I think that was sort of that tournament across was sort of taken from in a sense the U.S. idea of where we have playoffs and we have a round robin tournament all regular season, then a playoff championship tournament to determine the actual champion. And their sports have always been really just a regular season and the multiple leagues. What I was going to say is kind of puzzles, like rival leagues, and there's been all kinds of rival challenges to the major leagues here, and they haven't been successful, or the ones that have been successful have ended up merging. So you have the ABA, NBA, WHL, NHL in the 70s. Of course, the AFL and the NFL merged in the 1960s. So the most successful rival leagues have accomplished the goal of merging with the existing league. So we always end up back at one league. And so in sort of an economic sense, there should be room for all kinds of there should be room for multiple sports leagues. So what is it that always drives us to one league? And there's sort of this weird natural monopoly that isn't like a utility where you've got huge fixed costs of hydroelectric dams and power plants and all those things for electricity. Sports isn't really like that, although the startup might be fairly formidable. You're talking stadiums and television contracts and those sorts of things. But I think it has something to do with the product of fans wanting to know the true champion. So if you have multiple leagues, who's really the best? So if you have AFL champ and an NFL champ, we need to get them together to play a championship to determine who's really the best. And there we have the Super Bowl. And I think there's some sort of odd dissatisfaction, like, we might have more choices, and quite frankly, having one major league in each sport means you probably eliminate some cities that could support teams, but the league doesn't want to expand. And so you're right, the limitation on the total number of franchise would increase the franchise values of the ones that were there. So that's an incentive for the current league to keep other leagues out, and they definitely do. I mean, they've in past history they've made it very difficult on the rival leagues when they start to when they try to arise. There's actually a good documentary on the U.S. football league that was, I would say, the last really good challenge to the NFL, and they played in the spring in the 1980s, and they had 2 or 3 successful years. But the NFL, didn't like them there because they competed for players. So you had the Steve Youngs and Jim Kellys and Herschel Walkers that went to the USFL at very high prices, and they definitely pushed up the salaries for NFL players too. So the NFL was pretty interested in driving them out, and they succeeded. And when that went to court, the NFL was found guilty of an antitrust violation and awarded $3. Because they ultimately decided the USFL was mismanaged as well, but they certainly found evidence that the NFL had worked pretty hard to drive them out of business. So definitely restricting to one league is advantageous for that league and its owners.
And they had never played, right? Like the USFL,
no,
that could have been the demise if they had played in the USFL.
Yeah, they played in the USFL played in the spring, and so they didn't compete head to head in the product market. So the place where they really competed was for players, and the USFL did a pretty good. They went right after college star players and got them because they offered better money really than the NFL was offering. And but ultimately, then they talked about moving to the fall, and they. After 3 years, I think they ultimately folded and failed. But so it's a tough. So and of course, most probably more of the listeners would remember the XFL, the original version of the XFL in the early 2000s, and they had everything behind them. So they had the WWE and Vince McMahon and a major TV contract with NBC that the USFL never had, and still they lasted a year. So it's a really tough go for a rival league. And to me, that was interesting. The difference was the USFL went after really good players. The XFL made it a point to say, we're not going to go after good players. We're not going to go after anybody who would be an NFL player. And I think that's exactly the way the fans saw it too. It's like, well, why do we, that's not a major league then if they're not willing, if they clearly make the point that they don't have good players. Ultimately that's what people want to see. And I mean, I think you can make that comparison to, why Major League Baseball is so much more popular than minor league baseball and all across the board. And those players really are almost major league caliber, right?
Oh yeah.
But there's no comparison.
0.1% of 1% difference.
Yeah. But in terms of fan interest, there's no comparison at all. So there's something in the nature of sports that the demand, a major factor in the demand for it is fans want to see the best and know that that's what they're seeing. So some way that's got to be shown. And if there's more than one league, then we don't really know that. So we've got to have them somehow get together and determine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's like forming the rival league can be, exceedingly difficult, but if, it's like if you could make a team that could, and the NFL or somebody, they would never do that. They'd never play that game. But if you made a team and you won, you could almost usurp some mind share and power in that way. And I think that happened, like when I was reading the paper, it reminded me of, you see this a lot in like boxing, because boxing didn't really have the structure, and you sort of constantly had this, well, who's the best? Well, we're going to promote this fighter. This fighter's got the world ranking, and then they're going to fight each other. And now, now they're the best in the world, or now they're the best in the world. And that it was that constant.
Yeah.
challenge.
Boxing. Yeah. That's a really good point. Boxing has had this, various degrees of multiple sanctioning bodies. So the when the heavyweight division was in its prime, and of course they had they had the big stars, Ali Frazier for him, but in the 70s, there was little doubt about who was the champion. The two major sanctioning bodies agreed. And since then, again, and when people don't really know who the heavyweight championship is, or if it takes a lot of the luster off it, I think, for sure. And I'm not sure that that's the only issue with why boxing isn't as popular now as it was when I was a kid. But I think it has something to do with it. We don't really know who the champ is. There doesn't seem to be an orderly progression to get to be the heavyweight champ.
Yeah. And like you say, it's just a huge thing to know that you're watching the best.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else, anything that you're maybe working on now, or anything you'd like to kind of add or finish up with, or any topics that are of interest to you right now?
That's a good question.
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Let me see. What could I think things that are interesting, and we've already touched on it somewhat, is what's going to happen with college sports, because there's
a lot of movement there,
a lot of churning going on there. And I think that the NIL decision and the Supreme Court decision this summer are probably the thing that's going to get the ball rolling. I expect there'll be more changes there. I think what's happened in the last year in particular, with that the NCAA had kept very tightly locked, and so there were criticisms and a lot of people that thought what was going on there wasn't right. But you also have, and still have, really this kind of huge, almost maybe more popular, like, well, we don't want to change college sports. And that's I think another thing about sports is that there's a certain conservative, and by conservative I don't mean political, but I mean like
nostalgia,
not wanting to change, a nostalgic We
Yeah.
like things the way we were, and we especially like things the way we were when we were kids and first started to watch.
Yeah.
But there's a real fear of change, and so I think with college sports, but that was also true when professional sports were going through their labor battles and free agent that
In the
fans
Olympics, the amateur Olympics, well,
absolutely
you got to be amateur.
yeah, that
Yeah.
this would change things, and any change would, change can't be better in sports, especially. So any sorts of change are wrong and therefore bad. So we've got to keep college players as amateurs. We had to keep Olympic players as amateurs. We've got to keep the reserve clause in place. All of these things, because I think by nature, we don't want sports to change because we have these nostalgic memories of how it was, and we want that to be the same, and we want it, all of the generational things. It was the same for my dad. I want the same thing for my kids going forward, and I think there's been a lot. I mean, the college sports has benefited from that a lot. Like people, in some ways, they were able to hang on to. Well, we're the last one left, that treats our players badly, but I've seen a lot of that break down in the last year, especially the Supreme Court decision where just in the past month, the head of the NLRB came out and said, I think college athletes are employees. They should be classified that way. And so I expect there's going to be changes, that they are the last in the line of changes. But what happened in the Olympics and it's sort of the same effect. So the Olympics basically opened up to, well, you can get paid for endorsement money and sponsorship money.
That's almost exactly this.
And that's the same.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the same, but it's a pretty similar pattern. And then once you open that door, it gets really hard to say, well, we can't pay, you can't ever be paid. And I expect that they'll try to hang on to that the colleges themselves can't pay. But so to me, that's a real interesting one. I've been working on a book with Alan Starowski, who was at Drexel with me and now is back at Ithaca College, and Richard Southall and at the University of South Carolina on college sports. And it's a little more broad. My part's the economic part, but we've got more into it than that too. So that should be coming out from the University of South Carolina Press sometime in 2022.
Okay.
So that's one thing I've been working on. So that's one thing where I think we're going to see some changes for sure, is college sports. And let's see what else is going on in the sports world, in the business of sports world. I think there's sort of interesting things with what's developing that's new, and I'm not an expert at this by any means, but we've started a program at Drexel. I think we're seeing esports, and
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a lot of debate, and maybe your audience will wonder too, is that a sport? Because there's these debates, or are those sports? But there's been tremendous investment in esports. The major league sports, so most of the NBA teams or their ownership have an esport division now. So I think that's
Formula One has a whole
yeah, Formula One. Yeah. So there's a lot of investment in esports and a lot of interest in esports. So I would expect that we'll see that develop in, kind of, 15, 20 years, the 90s or so, X Games started to become really popular, and now we see them as part of the Olympics on a regular basis. So I think those sorts of evolutions are important to look at. If you were to go back 100, to the 1930s, boxing and horse racing were super popular, and it's not like those have gone away, but they've certainly dropped on the list of what people would consider the most popular sports. And we might say, I don't know what's here now that might not be. People are always worried about baseball, but I still see baseball being popular and high revenue. But we'll see what happens. I think it's always interesting to see how, what might be different in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years than it is now. The economic business environment will play into that a lot. And I think it's interesting to see what the outcome of the pandemic will be. I mean, sort of changed at least how we go to stadiums, and I don't know if if that's going to be long-term differences or not, but I kind of hope not. But
Well, and like kind of how does that, or has it, increased the technology that's used, people,
yeah, I think
spending
for
more
sure,
time watching,
yeah, I think it may tilt things more. I mean, media was catch. I mean, I think some estimates have showed that media has exceeded stadia revenue in the last year or two anyway, and I expect that will
interesting.
that gap will continue to grow, and it was probably happening anyway. But I think with the pandemic, it's probably going to make it somewhat more expensive to go to stadiums, and there could be some sort of lingering caution on the part of fans. Like, do I really want to get out with 20, 40, 60,000 people squeezed together in a place? And I hope we go back to normal, but you never know, I mean, but the cost of going to games could be higher with the checks and I think in the same way that 9/11 made traveling more cumbersome.
Yeah.
This could make going, entry into stadiums and so forth.
Yeah. And that combined with like the technology and the sports betting and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And like you said, media, there's just so many other sort of facets that you can consume the sport in.
And you just snuck in the other good one is betting.
Yeah.
Sports betting is getting really interesting because just since it was legalized by the Supreme Court, so in New Jersey, 2 or 3, it's really exploded. I'm right next to New Jersey here, and there's been just every other ad on TV is for sports betting, and I'm guessing that's probably true across the country, and more states have legalized
it is,
anyway.
yeah.
So it's a really active market, and it's really dependent. Of course, it's completely dependent on sports, and it's turned into, I think, a mini financial market where there's bets on bets and derivatives and everything that you can imagine.
Oh yeah.
And it's also potentially really lucrative for the sport industry itself, which
I was going to say and I'm not super familiar with this, but weren't some of the bigger platforms like owned or at least like the seed capital came from some of these like NFL team owners and NBA team owners?
Yeah. So they're
really
investing in it. Yeah. And it looks to be lucrative. And it's interesting because for years and years, they distance themselves as far away as they could from gambling, but it looks like for sure it's going to be an important source of revenue, and it's also changing, I expect, the way that people watch games. So if you've got bets on things that happen mid-game instead of just the outcome of the game, and bets on other games, it's interesting. So I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg with that too. So it's just getting rolling, but it's definitely something to keep our eyes on as sports fans for sure.
Yeah, it seems there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot's happening. In 5-10 years, a lot of things may look pretty different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and you're welcome back anytime. It's really an honor for us to be able to kind of pick your brain on this stuff. So
yeah, sure. It's fun talking to you. I always like to talk about this stuff, and definitely appreciate the invitation, and be in touch, and I'd be happy to come back and talk on similar or different topics.
Perfect.